All right, folks, so I think we're ready to get started. Couple more minutes, 1 minute, 4, 3. All right. Well, welcome to the Making of a Democratic Economy, a wonderful conversation between Michelle Baldwin and Ted Howard. I'll introduce them in a minute. So the format of the evening tonight will be a brief introduction by Michelle, and then followed by some discussion with Ted and a conversation, and then we will open it up for questions for about 15 or 20 minutes, coming to an end. But before we get there, I just want to say a few words about where this whole project is coming from, because you're entering into a conversation that we've been cultivating and working through in the city and with various partners for some time. And that is, we've started to explore inclusive economic development and community wealth building as a way to respond to the issues of precarious employment in the city. About 2 years ago, through the London Poverty Research Centre, we started by doing studies on the prevalence and correlates of precarious employment in the city. And what we found was that about somewhere between 35 and 50% of all jobs in the city counted as precarious or vulnerable. That is, those jobs didn't come with benefits. They were low wage, part-time, short-term contract, and that this had major impacts on the ability for families and people to participate in the community, on the mental health, physical health, and family dynamics. Right. So we're starting to feel this right across our community. So as we went from talking about that as a major problem, thinking about, well, what's the sources of that problem, we've now started to at least turn our attention some to thinking, well, what do we do about it? And that's exactly why we brought in two wonderful speakers, but specifically Ted Howard around the work he's been doing in Cleveland, around community wealth building, and really creating community ownership in the cities. So just so you know, around London, right, the context that we're coming from is that between 2001 and 2018, we actually had zero growth in full-time work in the city, zero growth. At the same time, we had about 12.5% population increase. So you can just see, you can start to understand where some of the tensions are coming. And as we, throughout the media and really across the region, we're seeing a lot more homelessness, housing crisis, affordability crisis. Almost all political parties are starting to talk about that itself, right? And so we really got to start being willing to take a step, being willing to address issues, and think about new ways of doing business. So, excuse me. So what we've been doing as a group is we've been bringing together community partners around a table called the Inclusive Economy Working Group. And through that group, we're talking about, well, how can we start to implement various community wealth building strategies in the city? And just today, actually, before this event, we got together with large anchor institutions, presidents and CEOs to start thinking and start feeling, is there actually some momentum to move forward? What we are starting to see as a group is that there's a common understanding that we need to draw on our own resources as a mid-sized city and build a more diversified economy, and that expecting global capital to step in and build up a fair and democratic society appears unlikely, especially when we look at the kinds of extractions that we've had in the city. Right? We think about Kellogg's, and the Kellogg's one, I did some work around that back when they were closing, and what one of the presidents of their union said was that 80% of the cost of a box of cereal is actually in marketing. Only 20% is in labor. And where do they look to cut the costs? It comes to cutting it in labor. And the factory in this town was one of the most high-tech, ready-to-go factories, and yet, they were well-organized, unionized, and they had to, and Kellogg's found ways to cut that cost. So there's companies who are doing very well in profits, but still looking to cut costs, seeking the lowest possible wages and deregulated spaces. So that's what we're dealing with. So the task ahead of us is, what can we do to build up our city in a way that truly lifts all boats, that empowers workers and doesn't treat them as disposable, cost-saving commodities, that provides opportunities for ownership to people who haven't had the pleasure of intergenerational support, and where meaningful work and community life are at the center. So I'd like to introduce our two wonderful thinkers for the evening, and I'll do a little bio just for everyone's pleasure. So Mr. Ted Howard's here, and Ted is the co-founder and president of the Democracy Collaborative, an international think tank looking to move forward a vision of a new economic system where shared ownership and control creates more equitable and inclusive outcomes, fosters ecological sustainability, and promotes a flourishing democratic and community life. That sounds great. Okay. As many of you know, through the Democracy Collaborative, Ted has led a nationally recognized green jobs and wealth building program known as the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio, also known as the Cleveland Model. Evergreen is an effort to create green jobs in low-income neighborhoods using a purchasing power of cities' anchor institutions. Now running over $10 million in annual revenues across 3 different enterprises. Just a wonderful example of what we can accomplish. What makes Ted such an incredible guest is that he does not only identify the problems of our systems, but that he is part of a response to those challenges, mobilizing both people power and money power on the ground for high impact projects. And that's what we're going to talk about. So thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
One more page.
It's a heavy page.
It's a heavy page. Mrs. Michelle Baldwin. So, Michelle is the executive director of Pillar nonprofit network, specializing in nonprofit management, cross-sector collaboration, and social innovation. She's just returning from this role, from a 6-month reflective practice and research fellowship about collaborative network structures and public policy. Michelle has helped to co-create 2 of Pillar's key initiatives, both community wealth building activities, I would suggest. One of them being this building, Innovation Works, which was actually purchased through innovative financing structures, community bonds, providing opportunities for Londoners to invest in the future health of their community. So I think that's just beautiful. And the other amazingly strong project coming through is Verge Capital, a social finance intermediary focused on local investment for social impact. So these are some of the centers of the future of community wealth in the city that we're going to be seeing growing and being increasingly effective. So at the forefront of social enterprise and social economy movements, Michelle represents the future of inclusive economy in London with her ability to bridge between sometimes unlikely partners and find a way to move forward. So thank you. I'll pass it on to them.
Okay, how's everybody doing? Yeah? How many of you are from the conference? Awesome. And how many are Londoners? Ooh, okay, good mix of both. That's awesome. Well, first, Ted, as you just heard, he spoke at the conference. How many people saw Ted earlier today? Okay. Then we had our 4 to 6 meeting. I hear you have another one tomorrow. So big thank you for the energy that you're bringing to our community and sharing. I've heard you a few times today and read your book, and you are in for a treat. So my role is to set a bit of context before we get into having the floor for Ted and then for you to ask questions. So I want you to just take a moment and close your eyes. And I'm watching, so you're closing your eyes. Okay, good. And I want you to imagine what you love about London or the community that you're coming from. And hold on to this question around what it is that you love. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Does everyone in the community that you're coming from have access to what you are holding on to? So today is about a conversation about, what is it that creates community, and what is that connection between access and inclusion and how we build a vibrant community. And I'm asking you to come on a journey to suspend all your judgments, those moments that you might have when you hear stories of, we've tried this, it doesn't work, this moment of, I don't know about that for London or from wherever you are. Let's get wild and audacious together about a future that we can create together. We have an opportunity in London to shift our economic system to make it more regenerative, to make it inclusive, and that making sure that everything that we're creating serves people and planet. Other communities have been doing this. We're going to hear examples. And what I've loved about today is that there's lots of different models. And so what we want to do is take those, the roots and the things that we think are going to really work wherever we're going back to. So I know this is possible because I've been very lucky to be part of co-creating, as you've heard, a few things in our community and learning from other networks around the world about how they've been able to do the same. And it is possible. And what it takes is really thinking about how do we change systems, and how are we going to solve our most wicked challenges, and make sure that we have an economy that meets everybody's needs. And we need new patterns. We have to really think about what are the things we keep trying over and over and over, and they're just not working. So we are facing a crisis here in our own community in London. We have homelessness. We have issues around housing, addictions, mental health, and the list goes on. And so we have to examine how did we get here and where are we going? And so this requires us to look at our power structures. What are the power and the privilege that each of us are bringing to our communities, and how do we redistribute power and wealth? Inclusive can mean actually doing the status quo, capitalism, extraction, and income disparity. And then we include people in the exact same systems. So what does it mean to really change a system? And so each of us needs to think about what is the power that we hold, what can we do together, what do we need to give up to create space so that we have an economy for all. So one of the pieces that I'm lucky to be part of is the Ontario Nonprofit Network. I'm the incoming chair, and we're doing some amazing work thanks to the Atkinson Foundation about decent work. So in the nonprofit sector, for example, 80% of the workforce are women. And so when we talk about decent work, we think, okay, we're talking about good jobs, but it's way more than that. It's a cultural shift about how we build on the values that drive work in the community. It's about decent workplaces that are fair, that are stable, and the truth is, and I'll even name it pillar, we have precarious work. We have contracts, we have lots of projects. So how do we build that equality and inclusion? And it means acknowledging the highly gendered nature of our nonprofit sector's workforce. We need more people to participate in the workforce and an opportunity to really dig in and break down those barriers. We need wraparound supports. We need to look at our transportation, our childcare. And cross-sector collaboration is the way to do this. Not one sector can solve this issue. It takes everybody, and it takes citizens, and it means engaging the people who are affected the most. So we've been doing some work since 2008, since around social enterprise and social finance. And we're going to be sharing more about that. Some of it we got right, and some of it we are learning, and we use the word failure. But there is an opportunity to put people and planet at the forefront and be impact first and not profit first. And so as we've been looking, as we reflect back on who we've been working with, it's been amazing how the social enterprises are trying to solve real community problems. They're looking at inclusion from that perspective. The other piece we recognized is you need to have access to capital. So Verge Capital is a intermediary, and all of the things I'm mentioning, it is not Pillar who's driving this. It is the community. Libro Credit Union, the London Community Foundation, Sisters of St. Joseph, SVX, United Way was part of our early days, and the list goes on. And we've financed over 30 loans to social enterprises, affordable housing, and community hubs in southwestern Ontario. And there's more to come. And so we know that access, and these are just a couple examples of tools, and you're going to hear more. So we can build a vibrant ecosystem together, and it means we need all different players at the table. So we've invested about $4 million so far, and we're dreaming big, and we hope that you'll dream with us. We know there's lots of different models, co-ops, worker-owned co-ops, social procurement, and so excited to explore that. The other one that we're really looking at in our community is community benefit agreements. And so how do we look at hiring equity populations to work on large-scale infrastructure projects? So even our recent transit projects, there is a requirement about community benefits. So as citizens, what are we asking of the City of London about what does that include? And we have amazing examples in Toronto and Windsor and other communities who are doing that. So how can we learn from them? So we have networks in this room. We have networks across the province. We have people who've come from all across Canada to be part of this conference. And what are we going to do together? And what's that network mindset of how we're going to weave together all what we know to lean on each other, to learn together? And one recent piece that I just want to share with you that we'd love you to be part of is the Women of Ontario Social Enterprise Networks. And I know we have some of our partners here. So we have Aquaho, Center for Social Innovation, Nordic Institute, and many others who are going to make this happen. And it's about increasing equity for women that are often overlooked and underestimated. And it's based on inclusive design, and it will have the Indigenous approaches weaved into it. And it means that we need to look at the systems that are part of that. So, as I mentioned, I have firsthand knowledge about how we can collaborate together, how we can co-create, and as we unpack a wealth of possibilities with what Ted is going to share with us, with an expert who's created lasting change, he'll be a storyteller of what's possible and nudge us to be big and bold and audacious and change our community for equity and inclusion for all. So, are you ready to come on a journey? Okay. Woo!
That was impressive. Where have you been all my life? That was awesome. God, that was awesome. So can I say a few things first? Because I think we're going to dialogue, yes, right? But first, I just want to acknowledge where we are, right? We're not in Starbucks. You don't get this kind of environment, you know. I know you've got Tim Hortons and you've got Starbucks. And there's something different is happening here because the community is here. This is actually community owned. You know, we have a bookstore back there if you want to buy the book. It's available, and buy lots for your family for Christmas and I'll sign them. But it's a locally owned bookstore, Bread and Roses. I was in Manhattan last week, 2 weeks ago, and I saw, for the first time, I saw a bricks and mortar Amazon store. I thought, holy cow. And I went in there, and it was like the whole bookstore had been curated by an algorithm. It was just like so weird. And I haven't been to Bread and Roses, but I know it's got a different feeling than that. So these kind of community assets are part of the fabric of what makes our individual communities so very special. And so first, I'm just knocked out by this facility. I mean, I wish we had one of these in Cleveland. So congratulations to you. And I want to say something personal. So I live across the lake in Cleveland, Ohio. Given the politics in the country, I often look across the lake longingly. And, you know, I'm like perhaps the most senior citizen who's here. And if anyone wants to dispute that, come up afterwards and have a beer and we'll change ages. I'm not going to tell you how old I am. But I've been involved in the work of social activism for 50 years. I mean, I started when I was in college, and that's what I've done. I've had a couple jobs that look sort of legitimate. I worked in the United States Senate for a very progressive Democratic senator back in the 1970s. I worked with the United Nations, lived in India, working with an NGO on international development. But mostly I've been doing the kind of work we're talking about tonight. My mother's 90 years old. To this day, she still looks at me on occasion and says, what exactly do you do for a living? And it's a hard one to answer, but one of the things I've been coming to grips with in the last 3 years, if you had told me after 50 years of activism where we would be in the United States is with Donald Trump, it is hard to imagine. And yet, I find this, even in the dark time we live in, I believe we live in a very dark time, and then you layer onto it climate change and growing wealth and on and on and on. And yet, I find this one of the most exciting times fraught with possibility of my lifetime. This is a time when ideas really matter, when people are feeling so distanced from the system, and I'm including the Trump voters, people who, in the United States, every public opinion poll is showing consistently that about 75% of the American public thinks, and this is the quote, the economic system is rigged against me in favor of the wealthy. Now, a number of those people decided to vote for a billionaire for president. So you got to figure that out. But there's this opportunity where people are really struggling with what is our democracy about? What is our economy about? And I'm very privileged. On one hand, some days I wake up and go, oh my God, I can't believe I'm getting on an airplane again. I'm on the road about 150 days a year. I just did a computation between now and the end of this year. I realized I'm going to be sleeping in my own bed 24 days or 24 nights. So I'm on the road all the time. So on one hand, it's, kind of exhausting. It's hard to get enough time to do your wash when you get home. On the other hand, I'm really privileged at traveling to communities throughout the United States, some in Canada, a lot in the United Kingdom, other places in Europe, and the sort of foment of innovation, creation of bold, exciting new models, solutions completely outside the box that weren't there 10 years ago. It is extraordinary. Something is building. And I believe that the system in which we live, given the trends taking place, is ultimately going to be incapable of dealing with that. And what we are doing, what a place like this is doing, the things you described with capital and so forth, we are building up within this sort of dinosaur of a dying system. We could call it sort of hyper-capitalism that we live in, or a neoliberal system, or call it what you will. We are building up the structure of a new system. In the United States, there's however, as a colleague of mine says, the ticket in to play this game of this massive system change is decades of your life on the table. So this is not for the faint of heart. This is like all in, ongoing, for decades if needed, to win this great historic battle that we face. Tonight we're going to be talking not about nice projects, not about great alternatives, not about neat initiatives. We are literally going to talk about what does it take to bring about the transformation of this system, to literally move beyond what we've been told throughout our lives are the only two alternatives for how to organize a political economy. You either have to have centralized state socialism where the government's in control of everything, or you need to have this runaway capitalism which is designed to generate huge growth, huge economic activity, but keeps leaving most of us further and further behind. So tonight is about how do we build another system, literally another system. Not, it's important who gets elected, prime minister or president. Policy is very important, but we're not talking about that tonight. This is not about politics, and it's not about policy. It's about systemic change at the very heart of the economy, the political economy we live in. That is a difficult thing to get your head around. One of my favorite quotes is, given climate change, that it is now easier to envision the end of our planet than it is to envision the end of capitalism. Just think about that. That is really true. You can really see this whole planet going, and yet it's hard to see how do we move beyond what we've got here. Now, if we did a process like you did, and we all closed our eyes, and you don't need to close your eyes, and imagine we lived 3,000 years ago, and we're living in Pharaoh's Egypt. And that system's already been going over 500 years, and it's going to go on way more than 500 more years. And it would be rational to think, and most of us couldn't get beyond thinking, well, this is it. There will always be pharaohs and priests and sphinxes and pyramids, that's just the way it is. And yet today, you go to London, you study it in the British Museum. Or if we lived in the Middle Ages, if we lived in 15th, 14th century York in the United Kingdom, in England, we would think that the church was always going to be in charge, that there's going to be the nobility, that there are going to be walled cities, and the peasants and serfs are going to live outside of it. And now we study in the history books. The truth is that human history is about the changes of systems constantly. It's a very common phenomenon, but when you're in it, it's very difficult to see your way through to another possibility. So tonight is really about what does that possibility start to look like? What do we mean by fundamental systemic change? Last thing I wanted to say is, in America, I don't know if you have the same terminology here in Canada. In the United States, historians talk about a period in the earlier 20th century that they call the laboratories of democracy. I don't know if you've heard that term. So the Great Depression started in 1929 in October with the crash on Wall Street. But Roosevelt and the New Deal in America didn't come into force until March of 1933. So you had this roughly 3.5, 4-year period where President Hoover, who was a Republican, was the leader of the government. And the ideology in those days by the Republican Party was that the role of the government was simply to protect the shores, not to interfere in the market in any way at all. And so President Hoover, as things are getting worse and worse and worse during the Depression, is convinced that the free market and the invisible hand will sort itself out. Everything's going to be fine. The Depression's going to end. Well, it got worse and worse and worse. And so in communities all over the United States, people started to realize no one's coming to save us. We have got to do for ourselves. We have got to handle these problems. And so in a place like Alaska, which in those days was not a state, it was a territory, they had a problem with lots of people who were aging, senior citizens, my tribe, who were, they'd moved up from the lower 48 up there to Alaska, and they didn't have any family members up there because they all stayed back in Illinois or something. And they're getting older. And there's no way to take care of them. There are no government programs. What are you going to do for these people who are getting old? And so communities in Alaska started to come together, people came together and started pooling their resources to create these little programs to take care of seniors as they're getting older. Just made sense to them. What occurred then is Roosevelt and his administration came into power in March of 1933. And they so the politics changed. All of a sudden there was an opening for something new. And his people start to look all over the United States. Where were the most exciting things taking place that could be scaled up for big impact? And one of the things they looked at was these little models in Alaska, and they were doing the same thing in California. And they took those little ideas in places like London, Ontario, except in the United States, and they brought that idea of let's take care of our seniors up and out of it in the first 100 days of the administration, created the American Social Security system, the largest social safety net we had. That was not invented by wise old white men sitting in Washington, D.C. That was invented in communities. And that's what happens when the politics change. So right now in our countries, it's very difficult politically, but our job is to innovate, to be the modern laboratories of democracy, to create things like this marvelous facility and so much else I've heard about in your community, so that when the times change, we're ready to go. We have the ideas, we have the models, we can move to bigger scale. You know, everybody knows that in England they have the National Health Service. Where did that come from? Where did Bevan get that idea to create the National Health Service? Well, it started as a small community model in a little obscure town in Wales in the 1890s. And decades later, Bevan in England said, that little model, we could turn that into a national model. The National Health Service now is one of the greatest assets that the United Kingdom has. So I just wanted to start off with some musings, because I've been with you all day. I didn't know I was going to say all that until I just picked up the microphone. So this is dangerous. You do not know what's going to come out of my mouth tonight, nor do I. But I think that's the opportunity we have. And so I want to invite you, there's going to be a lot of information, but to really see yourself in it. How does this pertain to where I live? What is my role, not as somebody in an audience listening to something, but my role as an agent to bend the arc of history toward where we know it needs to go.
Beautiful. Thank you. I heard you call everybody historical actors earlier today, so here we are, this group of historical actors. So what would you have a few examples, but can you share with us a few examples of what the little bit that you've learned about London, and what might be an example that you've been part of or that you've seen that we could learn from around, taking a traditional approach like economic development and kind of flipping it. So I know a couple of the ones you might share, but take it away.
Yeah, so, one of the things is, so first Mike and the folks at the Poverty Center have provided me with briefing materials, background on your community. While there's a lot of strength here, there are some structural systemic problems with the local economy. When your population has grown 12% over the last decade and a half or so, and there's been zero new net creation of full-time employment, there's a challenge there. Certainly in probably your community, certainly all over the United States, wealth inequality is growing in our communities. Even in communities that have very successful hot markets, the wealth inequality keeps growing. So we have these structural problems. And the interesting thing is to look at, envision, what would it be like if you took the economy of London, Ontario, which today it's producing benefits for lots of people, but it's also producing no net job growth, greater inequality, there's more homelessness. Certainly, your community, like every other one, is contributing to the climate catastrophe in the world. What would it be like if the whole system could be designed in a way that produced different kinds of outcomes as a function of how the system works? And the place that I think is really interesting and illustrative for a community like yours is what's taking place in a little community, about half the size here, a little less, called Preston, England. Preston is in the northwest. Has anybody heard of Preston? You've been to Preston? Oh my God. Okay, so Preston is in the house. How's that? That is a first. I have never asked that question except when I was in Manchester and people have been to Preston. So Preston is an older industrial city. Some people say the Industrial Revolution started in Preston. So at one point it was a big manufacturing, a strong city. And then it fell on very, very hard times. When I first visited there in 2012, the high street, the main street, was basically boarded up. Just building after building shut down. It had very high unemployment. It was called at that time the suicide capital of England because there was no opportunity. And so the city council there looked to see what are we going to do about this, and they decided to create an entirely new kind of economy. And they had no money. In England, the Tory government has imposed what's called austerity that has just whittled away the budgets of city councils all over the country. And they don't have much taxing authority, so no way to get revenue. So what do you do in that situation when you're the suicide capital of England? This was in 2012, Preston was listed as in the bottom 20% of the most deprived cities in all of England. So you can imagine this is very, very tough. There was going to be a huge traditional corporate development, economic development, a £700 million investment by a large corporation in Preston. That all fell apart. So there was nothing to do. And what they decided to do is, like during the laboratories of democracy, do for themselves. What were the assets they had that could be built upon? And even in a community that's poor, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland's one of the 3 poorest cities in America. Over a third of our population lives below the poverty line, for instance. Even in a poor community, there are tremendous assets that can be leveraged if we look in the right way. In Preston, what they did is the city council first decided to pass a living wage ordinance, which was at that time in northern England, Preston was the first city to do that. So they made a commitment to pay everybody who worked for the city a living wage. Then they went to other what are called anchor institutions, the University of Central Lancashire, the police department, interestingly. Don't really think of the police department as an asset in economic development in your community, but the police department spends a lot of money for goods and services. They went to the housing authorities and so forth, and they convinced all of them to set a living wage for all of their employees. So that's where it began, living wage for employees of anchor institutions in the city. Then they looked at, well, what is their procurement? How much is being spent by all of these public institutions? By, for instance, your university, your hospital, your city government here. Do an assessment. And what they realized is that those institutions were annually spending over £1 billion a year. So that's like 1.2 billion US dollars or Canadian dollars. So over $1 billion. And then they did an assessment, how much of that was leaving the economy? And they realized 95% of that $1 billion wasn't being spent in Preston. It was going externally. It was going to France. It was going to the United States. It was going to giant multinationals based down in London. So he said, how do we repatriate that money and bring it back? Since they started that, they've moved from 5% in the local economy, now over 18%. They brought over 70 million pounds of money on a regular basis back into the city of Preston. In a community of 150,000 people, 70 million pounds is a lot of money. Then the city government realized they had large public employee pension funds that had been built up over time. And they asked themselves, how are we investing these? And they realized they were actually investing them in a way that was bad for the economy of Preston. It was actually sending their jobs and money away. So they said, well, let's take a small portion of that pension money and bring it back and invest here. So they took 100 million pounds of pension money, public employee pension money, and start investing it in housing, in schools, in different kinds of assets for the community. Then they decided to start incubating worker cooperatives through the University of Central Lancashire. So they started spinning off small companies, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, in worker cooperatives where the people working there own the company themselves, not an external investor. Then they said, you know, we need our own source of capital. There are only 5 big banks in the United Kingdom. Every time we negotiate with them, the interest rates are exorbitant. We're not getting good deals. Why don't we build our own bank? So they started to build the Bank of Lancashire, where the city council and the county council are using their reserves and capitalizing their own bank. So they will have control over their own capital for local investment. Then they said, you know, we want green energy, but the large energy companies are all coal energy. They're not giving us what we need. So they started to build their own renewable energy company owned by the city. And then they wanted an entertainment complex. And they said, well, let's take some of the city's money and let's build it and not give it away to a developer. Let's own it as our own asset. And so what they're starting to do over the last 5 or 6 years is create a democratic economy. It's not an extractive economy that's pulling money out of the city. It's using their assets to build up their local economy. Employment's going up. We have the data we could show you on slides, but I won't bother with it. Their wages are going up. Now they used to be suppressed below the wages of the United Kingdom. Now Preston's wages are above, on an average basis, the United Kingdom's. And it's risen now in just 6 years from being in the 20% of the most deprived communities in England to, I said this earlier today, those of you who heard me speak, but you may have heard of this sort of quasi-socialist radical think tank group called PricewaterhouseCoopers. PricewaterhouseCoopers did an assessment of the most improved communities in all of the United Kingdom, and Preston, which had been flat on its back, which has created this almost quasi-socialist kind of local economy, but it's in a market economy and nobody's being forced, it's just building things up. PricewaterhouseCoopers says Preston is now the most improved community in all of the United Kingdom in just 6 years. Now there's a long way to go, but you can see how instead of looking outside, how do we become the next biotech capital? How do we become the next Silicon Valley? That's what the conversation is in economic development in the United States everywhere. Asking ourselves, how do we leverage what we have, and how do we build in principles about the importance of the place we live, about the importance of broadening ownership over capital, about the importance of place really mattering and keeping wealth local rather than having it leak out, you can really start to bring about rapid transformation. So start to imagine what it could be like here in London, Ontario. You have all of that Preston has if you've got the political will to drive forward that kind of agenda. So when I think of models, there are plenty all over, very exciting things happening. But that's one of the most comprehensive approaches to building a new economy that goes far beyond anything that our current larger economy is capable of.
Okay, fabulous. How many of you have read the book? How many are in here? Okay.
I have.
Yeah. Oh, I have too. Sorry, I have too. So there are books, but yeah. So you have lots of different examples, and the storytelling is the part that I think you really start to see what's possible. And the theme of trust was definitely part of that. Anytime you're trying to collaborate and build trust across sectors. So what would you say in Cleveland or Preston? How did that trust get built, and you've mentioned some of the actors or groups that were part of that, but maybe just shed a bit of light on the trust and the who.
Yeah. So. This kind of work that we're talking about in Preston, or we could point to, and Preston's one of the chapters in the book, and there are other chapters of these kinds of models. They're not technocratic solutions. They really are people envisioning what they want and then finding ways to work together. Oftentimes, improbable actors. You know, who would think that the police department could become a major factor in the economic development of a community? But I was talking to the head of the police in Preston, and I said, why are you doing this? Because it's like, why are you worried about your procurement? And he said, well, I'm not doing it for charity or just trying to be good. And for me, this is consistent with our mission. We're supposed to be creating a safer community. I know if more people in Preston have good jobs, there's going to be less crime. So I consider this a policing issue. And so building trust and relationship among people becomes absolutely important. Things we're doing in Cleveland, we have two major health systems, Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals. They do not play well together. They are always trying to steal each other's doctors and nurses. One system has, at least historically, called the other the evil empire. There were people that said you will never get them to sit down and work together. And yet we have, out of a shared vision of what's best for the community. Now, they still compete like crazy and beat their brains out on other matters, but working together. So trust is really important. And I think this idea of a democratic economy, you know, we live in an economy now that's a zero-sum game, and there are winners and there are losers, and lots of us are losing. And so, I'm not a big fan of vilification of people. I think we have got to foster a sense of we are all in this together. And in what I'm talking about, there is a role for the local business community. Small business, fabulous. Let's get them the contracts. Let's build them up. Worker-owned cooperative businesses, absolutely. In the United States, we've worked with Republican conservative mayors. Mostly we work with Democratic mayors, but sometimes conservative Republican mayors. We can all see ourselves in this. And so I do think the human element of trust is absolutely essential in this. And hopefully that the book helps communicate some of them.
I had, through a local foundation, Maytree Foundation, we talked at the policy school about cross-partisan rather than non-partisan. And again, a theme coming up today, how do we work across, you know, as governments are changing? And yeah, they've been changing lots here as well. Okay, how about democratizing the process? So we know that in order to do this work, in the examples you've given, you've worked with the people that are affected the most in terms of them being part of the solutions. Can you share a bit about how that happens?
In terms of
Cleveland or Preston, how did you involve the people that you know, are impacted the most by the lack of equity?
Well, one of the principles, I believe, of a democratic economy is it needs to be radically inclusive. Right now, we have a lot of people being left behind, and the prevailing economic development theory is just grow the bigger regional economy or the national economy, and some of the value will trickle down to those most in need. I lived, until recently, I now moved downtown in Cleveland, but I lived in a neighborhood called Glenville in Cleveland that was one of the poorest in the city. It was a 99% African-American neighborhood, so I was really, in that regard, an outlier. And about 40% of my neighbors lived below the poverty line, very high unemployment also. And I can tell you, the trickle-down theory just does not work. I mean, I knew it intellectually, but after living there 5 or 6 or 7 years, it does not hit the street unless you focus on the people that are most in need. Now, I'm not saying community wealth building is simply a program for those most disadvantaged. I think it's for all of us, including everyone in this room, and most of you, like me, have lived very privileged lives. Not all of you, but most of us, let's face it. But it is for all of us. But if we don't systematically target the benefits to people who have been left behind, it is not going to reach them. In the United States, you have your own issues here with indigenous populations, and many people have been left out. In the United States, we have got to come to terms with, and my organization leads with this, we have got to come to terms with racial equity becomes an essential component. Let's face it, in the United States, all the land was stolen from the people who used to live there, and one of the great genocides was perpetrated, and 90% of the indigenous population that lived in the United States was wiped out over time. And then the economy was built on free labor from African American slaves. And if we don't take that into account, you can't talk about the kind of economy we have, at least in the United States. You need to think for yourself in this country. You cannot talk about our capitalism without acknowledging how it was built, and we can't build a democratic economy without that acknowledgement. So, and this is one of the great challenges for all of us. The New York Times just published a series called 1619, which if you haven't read it, even though you're not from the United States, I highly recommend. It's all available online. And it's 1619 was when the first slave from Africa was brought to the United States. And looking at how there's an incredible long piece about how slavery, and then after slavery, the 150 or 200 years since, how while the myth in America is that our economy was built by the heroic entrepreneur, you know, in their garages and maxing out their credit cards and creating these great companies, yeah, all that happened. But it was built on stolen land and stolen labor. And so, you know, you just have to do this work. In Cleveland, we've started a network of for-profit worker-owned cooperatives called the Evergreen Cooperative. Some of you may have heard of that. I know a number of you visited it because I'm like a tour guide for Evergreen down there. And we've hired about 300 people who are working full-time. They're owners of these companies. Most of them are unemployed, overwhelmingly people of color. 50% of the workers in these companies who are now owners of their business were formerly incarcerated, some for 10 years in prison. One of the first people, and I'll stop because I'm going on too long, but one of the first people that we hired was a fellow who, he was an ex-Marine, a black guy, ex-Marine. He'd been, you know, extraordinary father with 5 children and so forth. And then he made a mistake. He got involved with some people he shouldn't have, and he stole about $20,000 of copper pipe tubing from a construction site. He was caught. The first time he'd ever commit a crime. He was caught. The judge threw the book at him. He went to prison for 5 years. So when we hired Keith, he was living in his car. He'd lost his family because of this. He had just gotten out of prison. But we hired him because he had these great skills from the military. He knew how to do electrical work and equipment. And so we hired him to run the machines in our Evergreen Cooperative Laundry. And I asked him what this opportunity meant to him, that he now had this job. And I thought he was going to say, well, I've got a steady paycheck. So, you know, living wage, hallelujah. He didn't say that at all. He said something very, very profound, which I think gets to the question of why we need to ensure that those most disadvantaged have this opportunity. He said, I never thought a person like me could ever own a piece of a company like this. And just think of that. That stayed with me for years. The glass ceiling that so many people have because they just feel these opportunities aren't available to them. And so the economic value of these kinds of models is extraordinary. But the psychological value to really allow people to become who they could be is what this is in many ways truly about. And that, again, is at the heart of a democratic economy, because a democratic economy doesn't see labor as just a factor of production that should be squeezed as much as possible. It sees labor as at the heart of it. If you visit Mondragon in Spain, the largest worker cooperative network, business network in the world, industrial scale, It's extraordinary. They have over 100 companies, 70,000 some people who are owners of their companies. It's very successful, 20 billion euros of revenue, 7th largest corporation in Spain. Unbelievable to look at this worker-owned democratic company. And when I was there, I've been there 6 times, and when I was there recently, I said, what's the difference between your system and our system? And they said, well, in your system, in America, in your system, capital is in first place over labor. So when your companies get in trouble or there's a recession, it's very rational, logical for you to preserve the capital because it's in first place, which means the investors, and get rid of as much labor as possible to cut costs. That just makes sense. In our system, labor is in first place over capital. So when we get in trouble, we ask ourselves, how do we keep the business running, but keep everybody working? What do we need to do? And they have strategies to do that. And that is a different design principle in a democratic economy than in the kind of economy we live in now.
Wonderful. Okay, so in the spirit of inclusion, you're going to get a moment to ask questions here. So as you just think about those questions, and I see Trish is getting ready here, I want to ask you, just while we're getting Trish up here, when people say this is impossible, how do you answer that? And are you thinking of your questions? Like, I imagine you get pushback and people say this isn't possible. So how do you manage that?
Well, when I'm irritated, I say, wake the hell up. What do you think is happening? But first, it's, changing the entire system of capitalism, we can't prove that's going to happen. But just look at history. It does happen. So something's going to change. We can point to lots of places like Mondragon where extraordinary things have happened. There are miracles happening every day all over our countries. We just don't acknowledge them. So, I'm just not a big fan for this is impossible. I think we need, it's self-indulgent. I'll tell you, it's self-indulgent to think it's not possible, or it's too hard, or I'm too stressed out, or I don't, or the problem's too big. That's just a way to let ourselves off the hook. So, I don't buy it. But as I said at the beginning, you got to put decades of your life on the table in order to make it happen.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Trish Hennessy, who's the Executive Director of Upstream, who is obviously a possibility thinker with the kind of work that she's doing. Upstream's a national think tank that seeks to reframe public discourse around addressing the social determinants of health in order to build a healthier society. So she's going to help navigate the question period here.
Thank you, and let's thank Michelle and Ted for giving us some amazing food for thought tonight. So when we imagined my doing this part, I'm going to age myself. I was going to be like Phil Donahue, sort of going all over. So, for anyone who doesn't get it, talk to me later. But we don't have a cordless microphone. So this is as far as I go. So that means you have to come to me. My job here is to make sure that we hear from as many of you as possible. So I'm asking you to be very brief with your comment and question. Around the 1 minute mark, I might just sort of tap your shoulder a little bit. And it's really in the service of making sure that as many of you here as possible get heard. So please come, we want to hear from you.
I'd like to ask if any city officials are here to try to calculate how much money is shipped off out of Ontario or out of London for the purpose of purchasing food, and then try to calculate how much we could keep here if community gardens were fostered. There's a lot of us that are trying to grow food forests and community gardens, and we're not getting very much support. But if we could save $1 billion in food being shipped, money being shipped to Florida, that could stay here in the local economy.
Ted, do you have experience with this?
Well, first, the first thing I'd say, data here is our friend. So there's something you could do in a community called a leakage study, and that's to look at how much public authorities, hospitals, universities, so forth are spending and where that money's going. It was very, very powerful in Cleveland when we did a leakage study, and it was a back of the envelope calculation. You could do really serious academic university studies too. But this one showed that our three biggest anchor institutions, the two hospitals and university, every year spent $3 billion on goods and services, and yet virtually all of it was leaving our area. We did another one in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In New Mexico, this is mind-blowing, of all the food consumed in New Mexico, the state of New Mexico, only 2% is grown in New Mexico. All that money is going to California. So doing these kinds of studies and publicizing them and holding them up is very, very powerful to capture attention and build strategies out of. And I'm very big on building a local food economy. We're doing that in Cleveland through our Evergreen Green City Growers, where we're growing 3 million heads of lettuce downtown Cleveland in a worker-owned company. And I think one of the easiest strategies to begin to build the democratic economy is through local food. So absolutely, I think that's a great idea.
You can hold the mic for me? Yeah. Okay, my question is about how well is this movement, because I see it as a movement that's been around for a long time, leveraging the power of storytelling and media. So a lot of times mainstream media doesn't cover any of the stuff that you're talking about, or only top-line stories. And at this conference here today, I'm not sure how many bloggers, how many independent media outlets, how many reader-supported outlets, there are about 95 of them out there, are here kind of talking about this. So I'm interested in the role of language. When you say, for example, labor, I think, can we say magic instead of labor? And can we say, instead of ROI, can we say gratitude? You know, that's your repayment for your investment. How can we reinvent the language and leverage media to get this message out more prominently?
And do you want to share who you are, actually? Do you mind, so that people will find you, since this is one of our partners for the Women of Ontario Social Enterprise Network.
Very exciting project. I'm a feminist entrepreneur, and my name is PK Much, and I run a media company.
You know, I think, so I can't respond to the specifics of who's doing what and so forth, but I do believe that a fundamental part of building this new economy and bringing about this system change is narrative, and actually shifting the narrative. Our societies have bought into a certain narrative already that's been inculcated in us. I mean, everybody knows, right, that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that if you grow the economy, it'll trickle down to those who need it most. You know, all these things that there's literally no proof that they're true. Sometimes I feel like I live in the Matrix, right? And we've got to choose the blue pill or the red pill, because we have got to move beyond this mega narrative we're in. And that's what our book does. You know, somebody said, you know, who's going to buy a book with the word economy in the title? It's probably, and that was my co-author. I wish he'd said that before we named it. But trust me, this is not a turgid academic prose. This is a storytelling book around new narratives for the economy. So I completely agree that that's essential to getting the job done.
And I would add, I believe community storytelling, and I know our community came together, and we've been hosting an event called the Pillar Community Innovation Awards. And in our theory around networks, we believe that one of the network principles is storytelling and impact. And so we've partnered with all the, I guess you'll call it mainstream media, as well as other groups, and we tell a story leading up to the event and after the event to really highlight highlight what's happening around collaboration, impact, leadership, and innovation. And so it's been, I honestly, when we started this 14 years ago, never dreamed we'd have 1,000 people in the room from all different perspectives. And we're really trying to bring a better inclusion lens with that. But other communities, if you want to learn from this, we're happy to just share it. But I would agree there's ways to do that and inspire hope and have people walk away and feel like they can be active citizens in this moment.
Hello, my name is Ana Teresa Portillo. I can hold it. Or do you need? Okay. Okay, oh, sorry. I'm visiting here from Parkdale. I had one quick question. So reading your book, I think one of the main arguments is that to make transformative theory and practice common sense, to make it visible, to make something visible that as of yet is invisible. So in many ways, your audience is one that's disconnected to this transformative world that's happening, really at the peripheries. And so my question is, how about those communities that really have been at the center of this transformative world, this transformative theory and practice, those communities for which what you're talking about is actually not invisible, is very present and palpable, and things that they have for generations lived in. What is the place for those communities in the work that you're putting forward?
Well, it's just, why don't you tell me? I think you've got an answer to that. It's a good question. Because you're quite right. I mean, if you look, like, many of the things we're talking about, you know, at least in the U.S. context, have had a long history, for instance, in the African American community, like the community land trust movement in the United States. You know, it got kind of famous because Bernie Sanders did it in Burlington, Vermont when he was mayor. But where it came from was the South of the United States with African American farmers who were trying to protect their land. So there's a long history of this kind of thing, again, in some of the most marginalized communities. And a lot of, we've worked with Native American, we call Native American indigenous people communities in the United States. And a lot of this community wealth building sense that we're talking about here, I learned from the Oglala Sioux, for instance. They consider just part and parcel of what their culture has been about forever, like not private ownership of land, for instance. So there's a lot of traditional wisdom that needs to be lifted up into this.
Just to respond to your question, I think, you know, how do we make this transformative world more visible while not recentering the same people that have been privileged over generations?
Exactly.
How do we center those people who really have been struggling with these issues? How do we not appropriate that knowledge and really commodify and create niche markets for it?
Yep.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Thank you.
Hello, Ted. So this question is going to make me sound like a skeptic. So I'm not a skeptic, but just for fun, and this is going to be a bit of an extreme example. So your example about Albuquerque, 98% of the money they spend on food is from out of state. So let's say they do repatriate that. Let's say they build a vibrant local food ecosystem, kind of like what you have in Cleveland, and obviously that money now stays in Albuquerque instead of going to other communities. What if somebody were to say, well, those other communities relied, like their economy is based on producing food and exporting that to other states and other communities. Now you've taken a big chunk out of their economy. Now they're on the decline and are, you know, going towards the state that Preston was going. How would you respond to that kind of thought experiment?
So I think that's a good one. And, you know, what I'm talking about is, I mean, one could say, well, isn't this what Donald Trump's doing? Right? He's just trying to move it all back to the United States and the hell with the rest of the world. And I would say, no, that's not what we're trying to do. First, at least in the United States, the pendulum has swung so far toward global markets, large corporations, all that, that to move it back somewhat towards center to have communities that have some self-reliance and resilience to them is an appropriate thing to do. We're not talking about every community at war with every other community and walling themselves off. I think the other thing is, if you look at something like the Albuquerque example, well, where are they getting their food? They're not getting it from small farmers in other states who are mom and pop and they're trying to make something work. It's just from gigantic agribusinesses, investor-driven, highly extractive, not good labor practices, not good wages. We're not trying to recreate that in Albuquerque. In New Mexico, we're trying to build up local, smaller producers, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I mean, you know, you could play this out, and I know you're just, you know, positing something. You know, how all this develops and where it all goes, we can see sort of a direction, but I actually don't have the answer for all that. But I know we need to move the pendulum back. We need to make a place for community rather than simply being consumers of this giant capitalism that we live in. And it doesn't, the change for the massive system change I'm talking about doesn't, I believe it needs to be centered in communities, but you know, you could do evergreens and Prestons everywhere and it's still not going to change the system. So you've also got to be talking at the very top level too, the financialization of the economy, which industries are more appropriately publicly owned. I mean, it's a massive change. But I mean, I feel confident that we're not going to shift it in a way that just is going to cause problems for farmers in California. Maybe for the giant agribusiness in California, possibly. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm super honored to be in such esteemed company. And I'm up here, and I don't even know what I want to really say. I just had to be here. I'm new to the conversation about equity, justice, social power. So while I was standing here, I think I had something else to say, but our young man had a good question. You know, so we're changing the balance of power, perhaps. And what does that mean for those who are in power? Is that a loss? And I would ask you to comment first off on that, because I really feel inherently that there's so much abundance out there that really those who are in power are not going to lose anything when the few of us regain some prosperity, abundance. You know, I really feel that inherently. So if you could speak to that, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
And the other piece is coming from the north. I'm not from Southern Ontario. I'm from Thunder Bay. And yeah, go the north. And not North Bay, Thunder Bay. And I've spent a lot of time the last few years for Canada Revenue Agency, actually, helping spread the wealth, if that's even a thing. Like usually we take money, but we've been out in the north primarily, but among vulnerable Canadians, helping put them into touch with their benefits and entitlements that they're entitled to when they file their income tax returns. And I've seen in the north, I'm from Thunder Bay, highly Indigenous communities up there, but I've never been exposed to the extreme poverty and disparity in the north that I experienced when I was in the First Nations. And they've actually been referred to as the fourth world. So if you could comment on, you know, the changing of power and abundance and how we can really think about prosperity in our Indigenous communities, our real northern Indigenous friends.
Good. So first of all, thanks for being here and thank you for your courage to stand up. Good for you. I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. You know, in my youth, like 2 or 3 years ago, I believe much more. And you know, in this great revolution, we're talking about there are going to be winners and losers, and they've screwed us, and we're going to take it away from them. So to hell with them. I don't think that's going to happen. Whether I wanted it to happen or not, I just don't think. You know, what's happened in some societies like China and Russia and Cuba, I actually don't think that's going to happen. In the Democracy Collaborative, we talk about this concept, which is a terrible terminology. So if anybody's got a better term for it, come up afterwards and I'll buy you a beer if I like the term. but we talk about a kind of evolutionary reconstruction, not a revolution, like let's take it all away, but not just to reform, tinker at the edges and try to make it better, but literally build up a new system over time within this bigger system as we kind of hospice the bigger one out into its demise. And, in the United States, our economy is so productive that if we did magically divide it up equally, every family of 4 in the United States would have an annual income of more than $250,000. And given productivity gains, it's estimated in about 15 years that could be $1 million per family. So yes, ultimately, the kind of economy we want to create is not going to create the Jeff Bezos with $36 billion or $90 billion or however many he's got. That's just not the kind of outcome that we want. But I don't know. And the other thing I'd say is I do actually, it's hard to believe, right, the things I talk about. I talk to a lot of really top business leaders in the United States. I mean, not like Jeff Bezos, but really big business, right in the heart of the belly of capitalism. And they know something is fundamentally not working. They're not, lots of them are not very satisfied anymore, and they don't think it's sustainable. So I don't know how that will all play out. It's a good question. But I think what we want to do is build a system that produces different outcomes. And in there's going to need to be some redistribution and yachts changing hands and stuff like that. But that's not the point. The point is a system that creates a different value proposition on a regular basis. You wanted to say something?
I'll add to that. So coming from the nonprofit sector, our organization's been looking at equity inclusion for a while. And in the early days, we were trying to, shift the way boards were having representation and recognizing now that that's not good enough. Like, how are the voices valued and are they heard? And we were hosting a few years ago power and privilege sessions for nonprofit leaders to come and really, explore this. We started off with 45 people, and by the end, we had 15 people left. So, what does that tell us about what it means to give up power, even to sit in that discomfort about what that looks like? And we've made our own mistakes of, assuming that with the Indigenous community, they wanted to, come join our boards. And when we started to talk to different Indigenous leaders, recognizing the nonprofit sector and boards are actually a very colonized system. So how are we, looking at that and really thinking about that? And so how are we going, looking at differently and going to communities rather than assuming they need to come and sit on the structures that we have existing?
Okay, we have time for 3 more questioners here. So the 3 of you who are patiently lined up here.
Hi, Ted. Ken from Windsor. I just want to say for the last 3 years, I've had a chance to review a lot of your work. And, it's sometimes said that, sometimes you plant seeds that you don't always see that deliver great outcomes. And I just got a couple of points. And Michelle, your comments at the beginning were absolutely fantastic. But in saying that, one thing I know about community organizing, without question, there's a tremendous amount of skill, knowledge in this room that I think are going to be able to advance your projects. A couple of points I just want to speak about that I think you could speak about. And I just want to give you some examples. The importance of relationships, linkages, values, and a cooperative economic development culture. And I just want to share, because of your work in Windsor, Essex, we've been bringing some people together from all different sectors of the economy. And it's interesting that we're saying, let's drop the political conversations, the organizational barriers, and let's just have a conversation about deeply seated systemic trends. And then let's go further and let's start talking about values. And it's very often that it's our organizations that are building constraints that are preventing us from actually working together. And I would say that the important part about probably organizing is really about in building strong relationships, which we're reading, and around values. And so I know in our community, for example, who would be opposed to organizing around inclusion, in equity, in opportunity, building your local economy, buy local. And the interesting part now is when some of us are walking in the room together, everyone else is off balance, wondering what in the heck is bringing that kind of group of people together. And the other part about the relationship building is that when you're meeting people from anchor institutions, is thinking about who has relationships with those people, because very often, don't judge them based on the institution they're in. Build a relationship based on their values. Chances are they're going to organize, they're going to work with you on their values. The next part is just on economic development culture, and what we're saying in Windsor, Essex is, I'm finishing, is just how can we have a cooperative instead of a competitive economic development culture with London, how can we actually have a more cooperative economic development culture where we're actually thinking about things can be scaled in a much more aggressive way, and we can create win-wins. So I just want to, opportunities to speak to those points, because values is going to be what brings people together. And by the way, I just want to say I come from the labor community, and I'm saying to people in the labor community, isn't it getting tiring going to funerals every day? And I mean this with all, talk about justice, talk about whatever, but I will tell you absolutely this, I am fighting with the labor community every single day, saying this is the type of vision, these are the things that you need to be investing in. This reflects your values and this reflects the future, and it's time to start thinking about how people can own their own work. Thank you.
I think, I see Mike telling us that we need to wrap up. You were going to share a summary, Trish?
Yeah. Do we want to
Do one
cycle
more
through
question?
these two?
Okay. Is that all right, Mike? I'm looking to you.
Okay.
Yeah?
So we'll
Okay.
just do the two questions, and then you can, yeah.
Okay.
Very enlightening presentation tonight, and I look forward to reading your book. But while listening to this, it brought up a question in my mind. What are your thoughts on what Estonia has done with their country and their digital economy and the prosperity that's going on there? And how do you see that fitting in with your ideology?
That one I can answer very quickly. I have no idea what the heck's happening in Estonia. Full stop. But I'm for it. I bet.
But he's for it.
And if you know, then tell us.
So my name is Anthony. First, I just want to say thank you. Second, I wanted to say that we're building an environment, right, which is a bunch of systems, which is just a process that is combined together to formulate an environment. I mean, it's an ecosystem, that ecosystems formulate the environment, right? So I just want everyone to be aware of that, because that is what's going to make us move forward. If we build these systems, right, which is just a bunch of processes, right, if we build them correctly, we'll be able to move forward. I was wondering about what you think about which system do you prefer, I guess, from a voting standpoint, and if you've taken time to think about that universal incentive that's going to be definitely going to happen. But I don't believe that universal incentive, you know what I'm talking about. Just some guy and the president that's running for election is saying that he's going to give like $1,000 to people.
Yang's universal basic income.
It's not ideal,
no.
and it's not economically sustainable because it's truly from the previous economy, and that is also important that we know that the economy is going to be a new economy and a new system.
Well, let me just say very quickly. So first, I completely endorse your point of what we need to do is build ecosystems that can generate what we want to create. In the United States, we're kind of consumed with what I call project-itis. Those of you that are funders will know about that, because funders often like to fund little projects. And what we need to do is move beyond that and create an ecosystem that can become almost a machine, in a good sense, that is producing the kind of results we want. So I totally endorse that. They're building that kind of ecosystem in Preston. We're working to build that in Cleveland. That sort of thing here in London could be very, very important. And then you were speaking about one of the presidential candidates in the United States. We're down to 11 now. We're getting there. On the Democratic side, there's still now 4 on the Republican. But one of them is an entrepreneur whose name is Yang, who he's running on a strategy of what's called universal basic income. Everybody gets $1,000. And there are models of this and experiments happening in different places, like in Kenya and somewhere in Finland, I think, and here in the United States, Stockton, California. I think it's an interesting thing. I'm kind of for it. Just like I'm for, raising the minimum wage in the United States to $15 an hour. I think these are very useful things. They don't get to the systemic question. We could give everybody in the United States $1,000 every year, and nothing fundamentally is going to change except some people have some money in their pocket, which I'm all for. But the system itself will keep driving its logic. I believe everybody in the United States should at least make $15 an hour. I am totally for it. But if that's what we settle for, then this giant casino capitalism is going to continue to run roughshod over our country and our planet. So we need to do those really good things that benefit people now, but we need to not be seduced that that's actually doing the job that needs to be done. With that, I'm done.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, for being here. Mike Curry is going to come up again, and he's going to give some wrap-up thoughts. I'm going to just stand around here in case I need to.
Yeah, tap me, exactly. No, I'll be really very quick because I have a couple of pieces. But first announcement. So one, there's books at the back here to purchase. Sold by Bread and Rose Books. Please, they're at discounted rate, $25 in store, $35. Amazing. Do it. Buy one. I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Don Kerr. Oh, is he over here still? Oh no, he might have slipped out. Dr. Don Kerr did a lot of the research in London. Oh, there he is. Thank you. Around our employment issues and everything, so I want to get that out there. Ooh, Econowas. Thank you for partnering with us. I think a lot of our audience, we're in a good half and half audience here with Econowas in London, so awesome conference. Atkinson Foundation, who has been funding a lot of our work in London and making this possible. Upstream, our national partners who are helping to do this work. And actually, this is the only point I wanted to make about content, was because this is like a lot of localism going on here, a lot of place-based development. And I'll tell you, I'm very skeptical. But what makes me confident is when I see place-based development being linked across places. That's the key to movement building, to seeing this actually be effective on a larger scale. So I'm pretty excited about that. And that's Atkinson, our federal national partners who will help spread that good news. Lastly, photography. Miska Photography has been here doing their great work. Also, Chris Cosgrove here doing video. Thank you very much. Very astute. And our sound, Rory Loiter back there, professional sound man. This guy just whips things up and makes it happen. So thank you very much. And thank you to our speakers. Wonderful work. I look forward to seeing you more.